It was a warm summer evening when I finally stepped off the plane. After 8 long months of deployment in a distant, war-torn land, I was finally home. The air was thick with the scent of grass and gasoline, foreign landscapes I had grown accustomed to. The familiarity of it all hit me like a wave, memories rushing back with each breath I took. Lazy Sundays spent on the porch, the smoky aroma of neighborhood barbecues wafting through the air, and the quiet, comforting nights spent in the arms of my wife. My chest tightened with anticipation, and I could hardly contain my excitement. I was home. As I walked through the airport, the noise and chaos around me faded into the background. My thoughts were consumed by her, my wife, the woman I had been thinking about every day since I left. I had spent countless nights imagining this moment, replaying it over and over in my mind. I thought about the look on her face when she opened the door to find me standing there, unannounced. I pictured her gasp of surprise, the way her eyes would light up with joy, and the embrace that would erase all the months of loneliness and distance. I was finally back where I belonged, and I was ready to pick up our life right where we had left off. The drive home felt like a dream, a blur of familiar streets and landmarks that had become distant memories. Each turn brought me closer to her, to the life I had missed more than I ever thought possible. The city had a strange stillness to it as I navigated my way through the quiet neighborhoods. Everything looked the same, yet somehow different, like I was seeing it all with new eyes. As I turned onto our street, my heart began to pound with excitement and nerves. I pulled up to the driveway, the sight of our house filling me with a warmth I hadn't felt in months. The front yard was just as I remembered, the flowers she loved so much in full bloom, their vibrant colors standing out against the neatly trimmed grass. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, just taking it all in. I reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed the bouquet of roses I had picked up on a whim at the airport. They were fresh, their scent sweet and delicate, a perfect symbol of the love I was ready to rekindle. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. With the bouquet in hand, I took a deep breath, savoring the moment before stepping out of the car. As I walked up the path to our front door, I felt a sense of peace, a certainty that everything was about to fall into place. I approached the front door, the doorbell chimed, echoing through the quiet evening air, and I waited, my breath held in anticipation. I imagined her footsteps on the other side of the door, the surprise in her eyes, the joy on her face. But as the door swung open, the smile on my face froze. Standing before me was a man, shirtless and broad-shouldered, his skin glistening slightly as if he had just finished a workout or, more disturbingly, something far more intimate. He was taller than me, his frame muscular and intimidating, a direct contrast to the warm, welcoming image I had been expecting. His brow furrowed as he looked me up and down, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. For a moment, he just stared at me, sizing me up, as if trying to place who I was and why I was standing at his door. Then, with a sneer that sent a chill down my spine, he spoke. "Who the fuck are you?" The words hit me like a slap in the face, knocking the breath out of me. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Who was this man? Why was he in my house? Why was he answering my door? The questions swirled in my head, but I couldn't find my voice to ask any of them. It was as if the world had tilted off its axis, leaving me disoriented and lost. Before I could gather my thoughts, I saw her, my wife. She appeared behind him, her presence striking me like a blow to the chest. There she was, the woman I had been so eager to see, the woman I had missed more than anything else in the world. But something was different. Her hand rested possessively on his shoulder, her fingers curling slightly as if staking a claim. Her other hand cradled a swollen belly, one that had not been there when I left. My heart plummeted, the weight of her betrayal crashing down on me. The room seemed to spin as I struggled to process what I was seeing. This wasn't the homecoming I had imagined. This was a nightmare. She looked at me with a cold, almost bored expression, her eyes devoid of the warmth I had been longing for. Then, with a cruel smirk, she spoke the words that would shatter my world. "Babe, this is my dumb husband who couldn't even get me pregnant." The disdain in her voice was like a knife to my heart, slicing through the love and trust one had carried with me all these months. I stood there, speechless, as the full realization of what had happened sank in. The life I had been so eager to return to was gone, replaced by a cruel, twisted reality I hadn't seen coming. My world tilted on its axis, everything I knew crashing down around me. In that moment, as I stood frozen in the doorway of what was once my home, something inside me snapped. The smug grin on the man's face, the cold indifference in my wife's eyes, and the sight of the baby that clearly wasn't mine. It all collided in a storm of rage and betrayal that I couldn't contain. The world around me blurred, and all I could see was red. Without a second thought, I acted on pure instinct. My military training, honed over years of discipline and combat, took over. I lunged at the man with a speed that surprised even me, my fist flying towards his jaw with all the force I could muster. The impact was sickening, a solid, bone-crunching thud that echoed in the small hallway. He staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He hadn't expected this. He probably thought I was just some broken man, too stunned to fight back. But he was wrong. I wasn't just broken, I was furious. And that fury drove me forward. Before he could react, I followed up with another punch, this time aiming for his gut. My fist connected with his abdomen, and he doubled over, gasping for air as the wind was knocked out of him. The look of surprise on his face was almost satisfying, but I didn't stop to relish it. I was too far gone, too consumed by the need to make him pay for what he had done, for what they had both done. With a final, brutal strike, I watched as he crumpled to the ground, unconscious, his large frame hitting the floor with a heavy thud. For a moment, the house was silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood over him, my knuckles aching from the impact, but I barely noticed the pain. It was nothing compared to the ache in my chest, the searing agony of betrayal that had driven me to this point. Then, I heard her scream. My wife, no, the woman who had betrayed me, was standing just a few feet away, her face twisted in fear and shock. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open as she screamed again, the sound high-pitched and filled with terror. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, backing away from me as if I was a monster. Maybe I was, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was a fog, clouded by the raw, burning rage that had taken over. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with my life, had done the unthinkable, and now she was afraid of me? The irony of it all only fueled my anger, and there was no going back. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the full weight of what I had done started to settle in. I stood there, looking down at the unconscious man sprawled across the floor, my knuckles still throbbing from the impact. But instead of regret, I felt a cold, calculated calm wash over me. The anger that had driven me to this point was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it was no longer a raging inferno. It had transformed into something sharper, more focused. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I turned my attention back to my wife. The woman who had once been the center of my world now seemed like a stranger, her face twisted in fear and shock. The sight of her cowering against the wall, her hands protectively over her swollen belly, only served to remind me of the betrayal that had shattered everything we once had. "You think you can just replace me?" I asked, my voice low and steady, each word laced with an edge that made her flinch. "Move on like I never existed?" She didn't respond at first, her eyes wide with terror as she stared back at me. The bravado she had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a palpable fear that hung in the air between us. For a moment, she just stood there, trembling, her mouth opening and closing as if she was struggling to find the words. "Please, don't hurt me," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. It trembled with fear, each word a plea for mercy. Her vulnerability, the sheer terror in her eyes, might have moved me once, might have made me reconsider, might have softened the anger in my heart. But not anymore. The hurt she had inflicted on me, the way she had destroyed our life together, had hardened me in a way I hadn't thought possible. I shook my head slowly, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. The sound was cold, devoid of any humor. "You've already hurt me more than you could ever know," I said, my voice tinged with a sadness that surprised even me. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The silence between us was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and shattered dreams. Everything we had once shared, every moment of happiness, every promise, was now tainted by the betrayal that lay between us like a chasm that could never be crossed. As I stood in the middle of our home, watching her, waiting for something, an explanation, an apology, anything that might make sense of what she had done. But there was nothing. Just the cold, harsh reality that the life I had fought so hard to return to was gone, replaced by a nightmare I couldn't escape. The weight of what had just happened began to settle over me like a thick fog. The house, our house, felt like a stranger to me now. The walls that once held our laughter, our love, our life together, now seemed to close in around me, suffocating and unfamiliar. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall was a reminder of the life we had built, a life that had been shattered in an instant. I looked around the living room, my eyes scanning the space that had once been filled with so much warmth. The couch where we had spent countless evenings curled up together, watching movies and talking about our future, now seemed distant and cold. The kitchen, where we had cooked meals together, laughing and sharing stories about our day, was just a collection of empty countertops and hollow memories. Everything felt different now, foreign and tainted by the betrayal that had unfolded before my eyes. My gaze eventually settled on the doorway, the same doorway I had walked through just minutes ago with a heart full of hope and a bouquet of roses in my hand. The roses now lay forgotten on the floor, their vibrant petals a stark contrast to the dull, lifeless atmosphere that had taken over the house. I hadn't even realized I had dropped them, but now, looking at them, they felt like the perfect symbol of everything I had lost. I took one last look at my wife. She was standing across the room, her face a mixture of fear, regret, and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was realization, maybe it was despair. But whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with my heart, was gone. In her place was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized, someone I no longer cared to know. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to salvage. The life I had fought so hard to return to was gone, destroyed by the choices she had made and the actions I had taken in response. I knew in that moment that there was no going back, no way to repair the damage that had been done. The future we had once dreamed of together was nothing but ashes now, blown away by the winds of betrayal and anger. With a deep, steadying breath, I turned away from her and walked toward the door. Each step felt heavy, like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, but I knew I had to leave. Staying here, in this house filled with broken dreams and shattered trust, would only prolong the pain. I needed to walk away, to let go of the past, and to start figuring out what came next. As I reached the doorway, I paused for a moment, glancing back at the life I was leaving behind. The roses, still scattered on the floor, seemed to mock me with their discarded beauty, a reminder of what could have been. But I didn't pick them up. They didn't belong to me anymore, just like this life, this house, and this woman no longer did. Without another word, I stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting me like a slap to the face. It was a harsh reminder that the world kept turning, even when everything inside me felt like it was falling apart. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing away the remnants of my old life. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know where I would go or what I would do next. But as I walked away from the house, from the life I had once known, one thing was certain. I would never be the same again. And neither would they. The man I had been was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone more guarded. I had lost more than just a home that night. I had lost a part of myself. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The weeks that followed that fateful night were a whirlwind of emotions and chaos. Everything I had known, everything I had built, seemed to unravel before my eyes. The anger that had fueled my actions that night didn't fade. It simmered, boiling just beneath the surface, driving me forward. The next day, I filed for divorce. The process was brutal, filled with paperwork, legal battles, and bitter confrontations that left me drained. Each encounter with her was like reopening a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. She tried to reach out, to talk, to explain herself, but I didn't want to hear it. Her words meant nothing to me now. All I wanted was to cut ties, to put as much distance between us as possible. But the memories were harder to escape. They haunted me in quiet moments, creeping into my mind when I least expected it. I would catch myself thinking about the good times, the love we had shared, the dreams we had once built together. But every time, those memories were quickly overshadowed by the betrayal, by the image of her with another man in what had once been our home. It was a cycle of pain that I couldn't seem to break, but I knew I had to push through. I had to focus on the path ahead, on rebuilding my life without her. As the months passed, I began to hear whispers about her through mutual friends and social media. It wasn't something I actively sought out, but in our interconnected world, news travels fast. At first, I tried to ignore it, to block out any mention of her, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know how she was coping, if she was suffering the way I had suffered. And from what I heard, she was. The man she had chosen over me, the one who had sneered at me in my own doorway, had started to pull away from her. At first, he stood by her side, perhaps out of guilt or some misguided sense of duty. But as the reality of the situation set in, as the weight of what they had done began to bear down on him, he grew distant. The promises of a new life, of a fresh start, began to fade, replaced by cold indifference. The pregnancy was difficult for her, both physically and emotionally. She faced it mostly alone, the excitement of starting a new life with her affair partner crumbling as he began to see the baby as a burden rather than a joy. The whispers I heard told of her struggling, of her trying to hold onto a relationship that was slipping through her fingers. He started coming around less and less, his visits becoming infrequent until one day, he simply stopped showing up altogether. She was left to deal with the consequences of their actions on her own. The new life she had envisioned had turned into a nightmare. The love she had traded everything for dissolving into nothing. I couldn't say I felt sorry for her. It was hard to feel anything at all, really. She had made her choices, and now she was living with them. But as for me, I was determined to move forward. The past was behind me, and I was ready to face whatever the future held, no matter how uncertain it might be. The day the baby was born, it felt like any other day for me. I was going about my life, trying to rebuild what had been broken, when I received a text from a mutual friend. It was a brief message, simply letting me know that she had given birth. I stared at the screen for a moment, waiting for some sort of emotion to rise within me. Anger, sadness, even curiosity, but there was nothing. The child wasn't mine, and the woman who had once been my wife was now just a distant memory, a stranger in my mind. The baby, a boy, came into the world without the warmth and support of a family. I later learned that she was alone in the hospital room, with no one by her side. Her affair partner, the man she had chosen over me, had abandoned her completely by then. The excitement and promises that had once surrounded their relationship had long since faded, leaving her to face the harsh reality of motherhood alone. She had reached out to him when she went into labor, hoping that the birth of their child would bring him back to her, that it would somehow rekindle whatever they had shared. She sent him messages, called him, pleading for him to come to the hospital, to be there for her and their son. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. He had made it clear that he wanted nothing more to do with her or the baby. The man who had once stood in my doorway, confident and arrogant, had now completely disappeared from her life, cutting off all contact. Her desperation grew as the days went by. She tried to reach out to me, perhaps thinking that I might still care, that I might somehow be willing to step in and help. But I had made my choice long ago, and I wasn't about to let her back into my life. Every attempt she made to contact me was met with silence. I had nothing left to say to her, no sympathy or support to offer. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. The news of the baby's birth spread through our circle of mutual friends, but I kept my distance from it all. I didn't ask for details, didn't inquire about how she was doing, or what the baby looked like. In my mind, they were part of a life that no longer existed for me. I had moved on, or at least I was trying to, and dwelling on what had happened wouldn't help me heal. The baby was innocent in all of this, a small, helpless being brought into the world under circumstances beyond his control. But I couldn't find it in myself to feel anything for him. He was a reminder of everything that had gone wrong, of the betrayal that had destroyed my marriage and my trust. And while I didn't wish him harm, I also didn't wish to be part of his life in any way. In the end, she was left to navigate the challenges of motherhood on her own. The life she had envisioned, the future she had thrown everything away for, had crumbled around her. And as she struggled to care for the baby without the support she had once counted on, I continued to move forward, leaving the past and everything it held behind me. The months following the birth of her child were a brutal test of endurance for her. She had thought that the hardest part was behind her, that once the baby was born, things would somehow fall into place. But reality was much harsher than she had anticipated. The man she had sacrificed everything for was gone, having vanished from her life without so much as a goodbye. The support she had expected, the life she had envisioned with him, all crumbled into nothing. Every day was a struggle. She was now a single mother, juggling the demands of a newborn with the crushing weight of isolation. The sleepless nights, the endless crying, the constant need for attention, everything that comes with caring for a baby, overwhelmed her. She had no one to lean on, no partner to share the burden with. The friends who had once been her confidants, who had perhaps even encouraged her to follow her heart, began to drift away. They grew tired of the endless drama, the chaos that seemed to surround her life now. What once might have been seen as an exciting or scandalous affair had become a tedious, tragic mess, and they didn't want to be part of it anymore. As her world continued to collapse around her, she became more desperate. Bills piled up, the baby's needs seemed never-ending, and the loneliness grew more unbearable by the day. It was in one of these moments of desperation that she finally reached out to me. It was a cold, dark evening when my phone rang, her name flashing on the screen. I hadn't heard from her directly since the divorce proceedings, and for a moment, I considered not answering. But something made me pick up the call. Her voice, shaky and broken, filled the line. She was crying, her words tumbling out in a mixture of panic and despair. "I can't do this alone," she sobbed, her voice cracking with the weight of her words. "I need you, please, for the sake of the baby." I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the woman who had once been my wife, now reduced to a pleading, desperate stranger. My heart, once so full of love and compassion for her, had hardened over these past months. The betrayal, the pain, the anger, they had all built up walls that I wasn't willing to break down. "You made your bed," I finally said, my voice cold and detached, each word deliberately measured. "Now you have to lie in it." There was a silence on the other end of the line, a silence filled with the echoes of all that had been lost between us. I could hear her breathing, could almost picture her face, twisted with anguish, but I felt nothing. There was no satisfaction in my words, no pleasure in her suffering, only a numb acceptance that this was how it had to be. I hung up the phone, the finality of the action hitting me like a door slamming shut. There was no going back, no undoing the choices that had led us here. She had made her decisions, and I had made mine. The life we once shared was gone, a distant memory that now seemed almost like a dream. As I put the phone down, I knew that whatever connection we once had was now truly severed. There was nothing left to salvage, no reason to hold on to the past. She would have to find her own way forward, just as I had. And as for me, I would continue on my own path, leaving her and the remnants of our life together far behind.